Hey everybody! I am so excited for today because today we are going to compartmentalize the brachial plexus, which is just a type of organization so that we can use this method to take something that's a very large, very detailed subject and break it into smaller, more manageable, more bite-sized chunks so that we can actually understand each part and then at the end put them all together. So I'm going to teach you some methods for organizing that information, and then I'm going to teach you how I would suggest drawing it out because it's going to help you both in lecture for learning that information, being able to answer those muscle misfunction questions, nerve damage questions, and then it's also going to help you with lab if you're drawing it out because you're making that mental map. So come with me on this journey in our second video of our brachial plexus breakdown series. So to reiterate, compartmentalization is a type of organization that I'm going to show you how to use to your benefit. We will take a subject like the functions of the paths of the 5 main terminal branches of the brachial plexus and organize that massive amount of information into smaller, more manageable pieces, laying the foundation to build on later as we learn more and more details. In the case of the brachial plexus, we are going to compartmentalize the upper limb, organizing it into different sections using the joints that exist in these areas as natural separations that form the different compartments. First, we always establish an anterior view, also known as ventral or the front, and a posterior view, also known as dorsal or the back, so that while we are studying, we get a full picture. From this point on, whenever I do a compartmentalization video or a nerve/artery path video, I will make sure that there is a blank outline drawing like this one at the bottom of the video that you can download. Because I want you to be able to not only watch the videos and see me do it, but I want you to be able to do it too. Part of the issue that students typically have with drawing stuff out is that they believe it will take too long. And in some respects, they're right, but I can help you with that. The part of drawing that usually takes the longest is the outline. So like in our case, the outline of the upper limb, or the bones of the upper limb, with all the grooves and bumps and important features. So what I've done, and I'll continue to do for you, is give you these outline drawings so that you don't have to do that part of the work. Instead, you can either print out the outlines and draw on them, or upload them to an iPad or tablet and draw using an app. And please let me know in the comments if anything isn't downloading properly or you're having any issues so I can work on a solution. Okay, so let's start compartmentalizing. Here are our joints, the first of which at the top of the page is the axio-appendicular, which is referring to the connection between the appendicular skeleton, the skeleton made up of our appendages, our lower and upper limbs, to our axial skeleton, which is more of the axis of our body, like the skull, the vertebra, and the rib cage. The glenohumeral joint at the shoulder, where the humerus and scapula meet. The elbow, where the distal humerus articulates with the radius and ulna. Articulation is just another word for connects. This is where a joint is occurring. And the wrist, where our carpals connect to our radius and ulna from the forearm. Using those joints as compartment boundaries, we can separate the upper limb into 5 different compartments on the anterior surface and the posterior surface. So we have chest on the anterior surface and back on the posterior surface. These are the most generalized areas in this image and could be further organized, but for this video specifically, I'm going to keep them pretty vague. From the axio-appendicular joints in general to the glenohumeral joint is the anterior and posterior shoulder compartment. Between the glenohumeral joint and the elbow are the anterior and posterior arm compartments. Between the elbow and the wrist are the anterior and posterior forearm compartment. And finally, distal to the wrist is the anterior and posterior hand compartments. And just some quick vocabulary notes before we begin connecting nerves to compartments. Remember, the brachium can refer to the arm, the antebrachium can be used to refer to the forearm, and the hand has specially named surfaces. The anterior hand is known as the palmar surface or palm. The posterior hand is known as the dorsum or dorsal surface. Now we can connect these compartments we've created to the nerves that innervate them. Starting with the musculocutaneous nerve. Motor function first. Musculocutaneous nerve innervates the entire anterior arm compartment. Anterior arm compartment and that compartment alone belong to the musculocutaneous nerve. That means all of the muscles in this area are innervated by musculocutaneous nerve. So as long as you know where you are, you don't even need to know which muscles you're talking about yet. Every muscle in this area is innervated by the musculocutaneous nerve. When you get your arm lecture and learn the muscles in this area, then you can add them to this drawing, maybe listing the names of the muscles on the side, then adding their functions. The more you learn, the more you add. But the key is to start simple and not overcomplicate what's going on, so you can build the foundation first. Sensory function. Every nerve we talk about will have both a motor and a sensory function. I like to separate them into different pictures at first and then see how they overlap later. It's called the muscle cutaneous nerve for a reason. It first innervates muscles, then innervates skin. The skin that it innervates is found on the lateral aspect of the anterior forearm. This is the only patch of skin this nerve provides sensation from, and later on you will hear people refer to this branch that provides innervation to this skin as the lateral antebrachial cutaneous nerve. But for now, we don't care. It's all musculocutaneous to us. Next one, median nerve, motor function. Well, we know it doesn't do anything in the anterior arm because that's been taken care of. So median nerve innervates most, not all, but most of the anterior forearm compartment muscles. All but 1.5. So median nerve is a great guess when in lab and any muscle is tagged in this area. The stats are with you, and your chances of getting the correct innervation increase when you learn the exception to this rule. The rule is, I assume that all muscles in the anterior forearm are innervated by median nerve, and I learn the 1.5 that aren't. That way, I barely have to think. So long as I can identify and remember 1.5 muscles, then I am ready for any anterior forearm innervation question because I learned this rule. Less information is always easier to remember. In the hand, it's the opposite. In the hand, the median nerve is the underdog, the exception to the rule in terms of muscle motor innervation. It innervates 5 muscles in the palmar hand. That's not a lot compared to its counterpart, that is the ulnar nerve. The median nerve and the ulnar nerve, in terms of motor function, are like yin and yang. What median nerve doesn't cover, ulnar nerve will, and vice versa. The nerve that innervates the 1.5 muscles we didn't talk about in the anterior forearm was actually ulnar nerve. Now it's flipped in the palmar hand. The majority of muscles in this area are innervated by ulnar nerve, and the exception is the 5 muscles we memorize that are innervated by median nerve in this area. You can list those as you learn them because you haven't had your hand lecture yet, and if you have, you should add this information, but there are less muscles to learn, so it is much easier to learn this exception. In terms of sensory function, we are actually moving down to the hand because the whole anterior forearm is covered now, laterally by the musculocutaneous nerve and medially by the nerve we learned about in the first video of this series, that is the medial antebrachial cutaneous nerve. So median nerve provides skin innervation to a portion of the hand. It provides most of the palmar surface, more on the lateral aspect, and the digits 1 through half of 4, as well as the tips of those same digits on the dorsal aspect with skin innervation. So let's take a look at median nerve's counterpart, which is ulnar nerve. Allner Nerve's motor innervation we really already covered because we talked about the anterior forearm, and it's going to innervate 1.5 muscles in this area. Eventually, we will get a lecture on the forearm and realize that the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle and half of the flexor digitorum profundus muscle are the only muscles innervated by ulnar nerve in this area. Therefore, everything else is median nerve. In the palmar hand, it's reversed. Ulnar nerve is the dominator of this area and innervates most of the muscles here, all but 5 muscles we listed on the median nerve slide. And just to be crystal clear, there is one group of muscles of the hand that are considered dorsal, and those are also innervated by ulnar nerve. I just didn't put them on the posterior surface in this drawing, because the majority of your hand muscles are actually in your palm. You're probably much more familiar with the skin innervation of the ulnar nerve than you think, because most of us, just by living life, have temporarily damaged our ulnar nerve by hitting our elbow onto a desk or a hard surface that causes that numbness and tingling in the medial aspect of our palm and dorsum of the hand, as well as the 5th and half of the 4th digit that were not innervated by median nerve, another example of that yin-yang relationship. But in terms of sensory innervation to the hand, it becomes a 3-way relationship since radial nerve will also play a role. And we'll take a look at that in a second. First, we want to venture to the posterior cord branches and talk about axillary nerve. Axillary nerve's motor innervation is very simple compared to the other nerves. Because it is so simple, we're going to actually list the details. It innervates 2 muscles in the shoulder, the deltoid and the teres minor. And that's it. That's all axillary does. Sensation is also pretty straightforward. Axillary nerve innervates the skin over the contour of our shoulder, the bump of our shoulder. Essentially, it innervates the skin that covers the deltoid muscle. Nerve fibers go through that muscle and then branch into the skin above it. Lastly, but definitely not leastly, the radial nerve, motor innervation. Before we jump in, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that up till now, we have barely touched the posterior compartments, and yet we only have one nerve left. So we can kind of logic that puzzle out and know that the radial nerve is going to do a lot of posterior compartment stuff, and it's also going to be one of the largest nerves coming off of the brachial plexus. The radial nerve provides motor innervation to all the muscles of the posterior arm compartment and kind of breaks one of my first rules. Fun fact, some muscles in the human body have dual innervation, meaning two nerves provide one muscle with innervation. The brachialis, which is an anterior arm compartment muscle, is innervated by both the musculocutaneous nerve and the radial nerve. That's dual innervation. Another fun sort of exception, and it's less of one than the brachialis, is the brachioradialis muscle, which rudely doesn't fit into my compartments as it spans both the arm and the forearm. Brachio is from brachium and radialis because it attaches to the radius. Luckily for you, remembering its innervation is actually pretty simple since radial is in the name radialis. One of the ways I remember both that the brachialis gets some innervation from the radial nerve and the brachioradialis is innervated by the radial nerve is actually just remembering the word or phrase brachioradialis. And I pretend that brachioradialis is actually pronounced brachialis radialis radial. It reminds me of both exceptions or special cases in one word or phrase. If that sounds more confusing than helpful to you, forget I said it. Because not everything I say is going to be what works for you. But if it does help you, remember brachialis radialis radial.
Brachialis radialis radialidocious. If you say it loud enough, it's really quite atrocious.
And it innervates the entire posterior forearm, no exception. In terms of sensation, it really mirrors its motor function by innervating the posterior arm skin, posterior forearm skin, and the portion of the skin on the dorsum of the hand that was not yet covered by median and ulnar nerve, as well as a small patch of skin on the lateral aspect of the base of the thumb anteriorly. Now, some of you are not going to like drawing things out and will prefer charts. This is a valid way of studying, but here's my only gripe with charts. If they work for you, use them. If you have a lab aspect to your course, though, they won't work as well for lab. That's my only gripe. Anatomy Lab is 100% visual, as we ask you to identify structures just by looking at them. So the more your chart looks like the real thing, the better, because then it's not only translating to your lecture, but also to lab, and you can save time by studying for both tests at the same time. So compartmentalizing into areas is great because like we did with the nerves, you can do the same thing with function, arteries, muscles, veins, and lymphatics. It is also a great idea to use another method, to isolate one structure at a time and learn its story. This is my favorite way to learn anatomy, and I'm going to teach it to you so you can tell other people about this video so they can learn too. Before I give away all my secrets, tips, and tricks, if you are enjoying and learning from these videos, please don't forget to like this video, share with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you can see when I release more. Also, if you aren't already following, we have an Instagram and a TikTok. I don't know how to use TikTok. Yes, I'm that old, but I'm figuring it out. I do know how to use Instagram and will be posting other useful tips and videos on those platforms. So if you're interested, check us out. All right, here we go. So to start, take out a blank sheet of paper or a blank iPad screen, or use the printed outline I gifted to you below this video and follow along. On a blank sheet or outline sheet of paper, and that's important, it has to be empty or just the basic outline. After you watch the rest of this video, I want you to spend 10 to 20 minutes and close all your resources, lecture PowerPoints, textbooks, websites, this YouTube video, and pick one nerve we learned about today, and draw out its path. List the important relationships along the way like I show you to, but the important thing that I want you to do is close all your resources, because what you can put on a blank sheet or screen from memory is what you actually truly know and understand. Whatever you can't remember is what you need to work on. A lot of students I have worked with in the past suffer from what I call inactive PowerPoint slide studying, meaning they are looking at the PowerPoint slides from their professors and tricking themselves into believing they understand and know everything on the slide. The issue is that they only know it when they can see the slide, and when you get to the test, you'll come to a question about that topic and you'll be like, oh, I remember there was a slide on that. But that's the extent of what you really know. So you don't actually know the information on the slide. So don't get caught in PowerPoint limbo. Be active while you study. Say what you know out loud. Draw what you know from memory. And list what you know when you can so you don't forget the important things. I think that's enough unsolicited advice. Let's get into the actual pathway. Some of this will probably be a review. So where does the musculocutaneous nerve originate from? The lateral cord. So the most lateral aspect of the anatomical M. So I'll draw it like that. Then it goes into the arm and pierces a muscle almost immediately in the anterior arm compartment. And that muscle is the coracobrachialis. So I'm going to put that in my drawing because it's a very important anatomical relationship. Not all musculocutaneous nerves will do this because some are weird. So remember, they won't all look perfect, but they're all going to go to the same things. Next, it dives into the other muscles of the anterior arm compartment. Specifically, it travels and is sandwiched in between the biceps brachii and brachialis muscles. It is superficial, so it's on top of the brachialis, which is the deepest anterior arm muscle on the humerus itself, and then is deep to the biceps. You'll notice it touches all the muscles in the anterior arm compartment, and we know it innervates them, so that's why it's here. After it innervates the anterior arm compartment muscles, we know it should innervate the lateral forearm skin, and it does. It pops out laterally around the elbow and travels very superficially in the skin to provide that sensory innervation. If I poke you in the anterior lateral forearm, you feel that pressure, temperature, and maybe pain through your musculocutaneous nerve. Median nerve originates from the middle of the anatomical M, is made up of both the lateral and medial cord, how special, travels through the anterior arm, but does nothing while it's there. Just buddies up with the brachial artery to travel in tandem through the anterior arm compartment, but not to innervate it. It runs through the cubital fossa, which is the shallow indentation of your elbow, I call the armpit of your elbow, where it runs next to some important structures like the biceps tendon, the brachial artery, and then deep to the bicipital aponeurosis. All of which could be a part of your map. They're not all included on mine. Quick PSA announcement. Before you get intimidated by all the extra and new information, please remember you are not supposed to know all the details yet, and you will add information as you learn it. It doesn't and shouldn't all be there at the beginning. You're going to be okay. It then pierces a muscle of the anterior forearm called the pronator teres, so it innervates it. Anytime you hear the words pierce a muscle, you should assume it innervates that muscle. And by pierce a muscle, I mean it pokes through it. And then branches a lot to all the muscles of the anterior forearm except for 1.5 muscles that are innervated by ulnar nerve. Median nerve gives off a special branch called the anterior interosseous branch that runs, as the name describes, on the anterior side of an interosseous membrane. Inter means between. Osseous refers to the bones, and in this case, because we're in the forearm, we're talking about the radius and the ulna. So we're talking about a membrane that connects the radius and the ulna and separates anterior forearm from posterior forearm. The anterior interosseous nerve runs on this membrane until it reaches a muscle called the pronator quadratus. The other part of the median nerve that continued through the anterior forearm innervates most of the muscles, then runs through the carpal tunnel into the palmar hand. It gives off another very special branch called the recurrent median nerve that will innervate your thumb muscles, as well as giving off sensory branches that provide sensation to most of the palmar hand, the first through the half of the fourth digit, including the tips of the dorsal parts of those digits. Allner nerve originates from the medial cord, the most medial part of the anatomical M, then travels through the arm but does not have any function, leaves the anterior surface to then travel posteriorly around a groove called the ulnar groove that exists on the posterior aspect of the medial epicondyle of the humerus. Anytime a nerve runs close to a bone, you should think fracture. If the medial epicondyle of the humerus fractured, in a test question it might be described as the medial elbow is broken, or injured or hit, ulnar nerve is at risk. It might present as something like weakened grip strength from lack of functional hand muscles, numbness and tingling in the fifth and half of the fourth digit. The key takeaway is when a nerve is near a bone, make note of it. After its posterior dalliance, it returns to the anterior compartment to run along the medial aspect of the anterior forearm with the ulnar artery. While it's here, it's going to innervate its 1.5 muscles. Then it continues into the hand, gives off a deep branch to innervate most of the majority of the muscles of the hand, as well as a superficial branch to innervate the fifth and half of the fourth digit in the skin of the dorsal and palmar hand on the medial aspect. Axillary nerve is a short one, and because of this, I'm going to zoom in. It comes from the posterior cord. It is the first and most superior branch that then leaves the anterior aspect of the axilla very quickly through a space called the quadrangular space. And it does this with its best friend, the posterior circumflex humeral artery. The quadrangular space isn't really a space, more than an intersection of four structures that the axillary nerve can be found in between. I will be covering the different spaces found in the posterior shoulder in a separate video. For now, we can see the posterior circumflex humeral artery and the axillary nerve travel to the posterior surface through the quadrangular space, to then run along the posterior aspect of the surgical neck of the humerus. Ding, ding, ding! Another nerve-bone relationship. I want all my listeners to get these questions right on their tests. Surgical neck of the humerus should trigger you. You should immediately shout axillary nerve and posterior circumflex humeral artery because you can't help it. Now let's add another piece to the puzzle. If you fracture in a posterior direction, so the humerus comes back, you are 100% going to injure your axillary nerve and your posterior circumflex humeral artery. However, if you fracture or dislocate anteriorly, a different structure is at risk. Its twin to the posterior circumflex humeral artery is the anterior circumflex humeral artery. So that artery would be at risk in that different direction of fracture. So the direction of the fracture does matter. Pretty cool, huh? After wrapping around the posterior aspect of the surgical neck, the axillary nerve branches a ton. It trees out hard. So when you did your posterior shoulder dissection and you lifted up the posterior deltoid head to look underneath, you saw tons of branches of this nerve as it gets ready to innervate the deltoid and the teres minor and then terminate into the skin over the shoulder bump, aka the shoulder contour. Last one!
Oh, 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 oh.
The other branch off the posterior cord, it's enormous, is going to stay a little longer anteriorly than the axillary nerve, but not much. And then it's going to head to the posterior arm compartment to what? Travel next to a bone, in a groove it's named for. The radial or spiral groove is where the radial nerve travels from medial towards lateral around the midshaft of the humerus. While in the groove, it is at greater risk of injury. If you fracture at the midshaft of your humerus, you damage your radial nerve, which is running with the deep brachial artery, also known as the profundi brachii artery. Profundi, profundus, think of someone being profound. They are deep. This is the deep artery of the arm. Many different names for the same thing. So that artery could be damaged too since they run together. I mentioned the triangular interval. It's really just the area in between two of the three triceps heads, the lateral head and the long head, and is a place you can always find the radial nerve and the deep artery of the arm. The radial nerve, king of the posterior surfaces, travels anteriorly. Kind of mirroring what the ulnar nerve did around the medial epicondyle, the radial nerve travels anteriorly around the lateral epicondyle of the humerus. Not only is it at risk, being close to the bone here, but it also is here for a different reason. Remember my horrible memory tool for the special innervations that the radial nerve does? Brachialis, radialis, radial. It's not my best one. Well, it's in that anterior area right next to those muscles. So this is where it is actually sitting on top of the brachialis muscle and also just deep to the brachioradialis muscle, so it innervates them. Then it splits into two branches. One pierces a muscle, the other remains in the skin. I find this annoying. Here's why. The branch that pierces the muscle before it pierces is called deep radial nerve. When it comes out the other side in the posterior forearm, it's changed name, and it's called the posterior interosseous nerve. I bet you can guess why. So deep radial is a very short part of the radial nerve. One could argue a useless part, but alas, that's the way it is. The other branch that remains superficial is aptly called superficial radial nerve and innervates the skin of the posterior forearm and the parts of the dorsal hand that radial claims. Two things I failed to mention. The muscle deep radial pierces is called the supinator, and the superficial radial branch actually runs with the radial artery. So now you put it all together. You link your nerves to their compartments. You start to add function to those compartments. Let me give you one example. The anterior arm and really the entire anterior surface is what I refer to as the flexor surface because most of the muscles on the anterior aspect do flexion of one or more of the joints. The anterior arm muscles specifically are primarily forearm flexors. That is the bicep curl motion you see people doing in the gym. While the posterior surface is primarily composed of extensors, such as the triceps in the posterior arm. The point being, you can use this method for more than just the brachial plexus. You can use these methods for any area, any structure, anytime. Map out your arteries, include where they go. Map out your muscles, try including attachments. The more you can put down and the more you can compartmentalize, the better. Now, I know that was a lot, so go take a break and then try it. The worst thing that happens is it doesn't work for you and you have to adjust slightly to your learning style, but at least you tried. Test what you know. See if you learned something. I bet it's more than you think. As always, thanks for watching. If it helped you, if you liked it, please like, share, and subscribe. Our next video will be a super quick advanced brachial plexus video, and then I swear I'm moving on to other topics.